Alright guys, today I'm going to be walking you through my 4-piece Predator's Mark gear set review and DPS build. It's semi-hybrid in nature, utilizing 4 pieces of firearms gear and 1 piece of electronics gear, and it's something that I've definitely warmed up to over the course of patch 1.6, and I find to be extremely fun to use and also extremely powerful. As you can see, the stats normalize in Last Stand, so you will have more toughness. Though it is not a tank by any stretch, it is also not a glass cannon. It's something that's really fun, really powerful, and I'm going to kick it off while talking about my chest piece. For my vest, I've opted to run Reckless as I believe it's the best in slot for increasing DPS overall. However, it's not the best in slot for increasing survivability. If you do have an allied healer, I highly recommend the Vigorous chest piece. And if you want to be dishing out your own heals much more frequently, then I recommend the Rapid chest piece. Either or will do as a substitute. Again, Reckless is just for the highest DPS possible, not the best for tanking. For major attributes, you absolutely want health and exotic damage resilience. Now, health is going to be essential on pretty much any build in the chest piece major attribute slot, but exotic damage resilience, particularly for this build, is going to be essential because of the prevalence of Seeker Mines in the Last Stand game mode right now, and the relative strength of the Seeker Mines in patch 1.6. 9% exotic damage resilience is going to work wonders for keeping this build alive during burst damage encounters with enemy attack builds running Seeker Mines. So that's something I highly recommend at least on the chest piece. Again, aim for the highest possible major stat roll. That's a given on any piece of gear. And for minor attributes, you want ammo capacity at least on one piece. Primarily the chest piece, there's not really anything that competes with ammo capacity here. The mask on the build is a fairly straightforward item, at least I think so, and I've opted to run critical hit chance as a major attribute just to increase the frequency of crits and then the relative strength of the bleed based on those crits, since you do get, with the 4-piece of Predator's Mark, 50% of the damage dealt by the previous 10 shots as bleed damage over the next few seconds. So I do like crit damage on the mask here. And for minor attributes, 10% damage to elites is definitely not something to trifle with. It is quite powerful. However, if you are, really against getting lit on fire, since there is a ton of airburst Seeker Mines, or getting shocked, since a lot of people are running shock turrets, you can opt for one of those 2 resistances here, and it will be quite powerful with the build. Next up, we have our knee pads, but it can actually be a little bit complex to find the perfect version of this item, so there is a couple variable stats that you can swap out if you don't get the roll. Number 1, you want the highest main stat roll as possible, and number 2, you want a major attribute of health. Due to the new scaling on stamina and it being the worst major stat point, you want to roll health everywhere possible on gear to make up for that, because you get more value out of the major attributes of health than you would out of rolling stamina on the gear itself. Stamina, 1 point of it, only gives you about 15 points of health, so that's not something you want to spec into. So a major attribute here is roughly equivalent to 1000 main stat of stamina. For minor attributes, this is where it gets a little bit more complex, but you definitely want burn resistance and shock resistance. Both of those 30% resistances are actually going to equate to many more survived encounters in Last Stand in particular, due to the frequency of status effects and the relative power. So I would highly recommend having both. However, if you don't, it's not going to make or break the build. It's just a really good quality of life improvement when participating in PvP. Next up, we have our Predator's Mark backpack, and this is our 1 electronics piece. Now that is to unlock the competent weapon talent while it's not in the 3rd slot. So you do need 1 piece of electronics, but it's not really in bad form. The build actually benefits tremendously from having this piece of electronics, and it does increase the survivability, the frequency of healing, the amount of healing, etc. So it's really not a bad thing to run, and the semi-hybrid composition of the build lends itself very well to the playstyle and the overall fun that you have while participating in PvP. So again, roll the highest possible electronics roll here on your backpack, and it doesn't have to be the backpack. You can switch this out for any other piece as long as you have 1 piece of high rolled electronics gear. Now for major attributes, you want health. Again, this is roughly equivalent to almost 1000 main stat of stamina, which is very, very powerful. And for minor attributes, I've opted to run ammo capacity, though it doesn't make or break the build. As I previously said, you can swap out many of the minor attributes for something else. It's really user's preference. Next up, we have our second high-end piece, and that is the Savage gloves. And I have opted to run Savage because I do like to get the crits with Predmark to increase the probability of a high damage bleed, which then has a more detrimental effect on the enemy agent and gives more value to me. The bleed does still have damage, however, you're not going to see a visual indicator of them taking damage. So while bleed isn't as strong as it used to be, it is still quite powerful, especially because it slows the enemy down and you can land more shots after that. But that's just speaking about the Predmark gear set, and more on the Savage gloves right now. For major attributes, you want assault rifle damage, critical hit damage, and critical hit chance. That perfect trio is the absolute best way to increase DPS. However, if you do want to roll skill haste, that will increase survivability slightly. It will allow you to pop your heals more often, etc. So that is a viable alternative to either critical hit chance or critical hit damage. The value, though, on the assault rifle damage is tremendously high. That applies before the next consecutive bonuses of percent weapon damage. So I would definitely highly recommend running assault rifle damage as a major attribute on your Savage gloves. Again, always aim for the highest possible main stat roll. Last up, we have our Predator's Mark holster. Very straightforward item. You just want the highest possible main stats and then health as a major attribute. However, if you really are intent on boosting your DPS as much as possible, you could switch this out for something like reload speed that would have a tangible impact on the amount of damage that you can deal over the course of a couple of encounters. And if you really are intent on popping your skills more often, you can swap this out for skill haste. This is the lowest rolling amount of health on the gear, and thus it's the most flexible. So this is user's preference, though I highly recommend health if you are going for higher toughness overall. For a weapon, I have chosen to go with this LVOA-C, though it isn't the only viable option. You can switch it out for an MP7, any type of SMG, since you will still benefit from the 3-piece Predator's Mark bonus with the SMG archetype. You can switch it out for an M4, whether it be a lightweight M4 or a police M4. It doesn't really matter. A Navy MP5, an MP5 ST. Any of those gun types are going to perform extremely well. But something that I look for is a high RPM version of the gun so that I can, proc that bleed extremely quickly in fights. Now for the talents, there's a couple specific things to note that make the build function to a much higher caliber than it otherwise would. Number one is that you want responsive, competent, and unforgiving in that order. And I'll tell you exactly why. Competent can be procced very easily and activated very easily with one piece of electronics gear. That's why we have the backpack. Responsive is very easy to activate all the time. All you need is one stamina mod in order to activate it if you don't roll any stamina pieces whatsoever, and that's why we have one of them in our gear. But Unforgiving requires 4,800 plus stamina in order to activate it, and that is not worthwhile. Stamina is the weakest attribute in the game right now for main stats, and you don't want to spec that heavily into it. Having it in the third slot allows you to achieve 3 different percentage weapon damage bonuses, allowing you very easily in some encounters to achieve over 45% increased damage simply from face trading with the enemy. So that is why Unforgiving should be in the third slot, and that's why I've chosen to go with this weapon. I believe this to be the ultimate god roll in 1.6. For gear mods, I recommend 3 firearms mods with health to increase DPS, 1 stamina mod with health in order to guarantee the activation of responsive on your primary weapon, and then 1 electronics mod with health in order to guarantee the activation of competent while it's not in the third slot. For all performance mods, I highly recommend First Aid Self-Heal. Since you do have 1 piece of electronics gear and 1 electronics mod, you will actually get a ton of value out of these. Your heal is not going to be baseline 0 like many other DPS builds are because they spec primarily into firearms. Since you do have that semi-hybrid nature of electronics, your heal will actually have a decent margin and then improve upon that margin with the 4 additional First Aid Self-Heal performance mods. For weapon mods, even though it is an assault rifle archetype, I have made the decision to spec into critical hit chance and critical hit damage, despite the fact it's not an SMG. An extended mag is always necessary. You want critical hit damage on your underbarrel if you are following this build template. You want critical hit damage and critical hit chance on your muzzle brake, and then you want critical hit chance and maybe some headshot damage on your optic. For skills, I highly recommend Booster Shot due to the increased damage and damage mitigation. I think that's kind of a staple in most DPS builds now. And then the Recon Pack on your pulse. This allows for it to be popped much more frequently, every 36 seconds, and then with additional cooldown reduction, it can be popped even more frequently. But that is variable. You can switch that out for something else, anything else that you really want to run. You can run a support station for increased healing and instantly detonate it on top of your character. You can switch it out for the Scrambler modifier on the pulse. You could run a turret or a Seeker Mine. It doesn't really matter. The primary skill that you need to be running and focusing on is Booster Shot. For talents, I recommend running a fairly selfish spread with Critical Save, Shrapnel, Strike Back, and then On the Move as the 4th. All of these are going to increase your own survivability with On the Move and Critical Save in particular increasing mitigation, Strike Back decreasing cooldowns, and proccing in tandem with Unforgiving to make you much more lethal at lower segments of health. And then Shrapnel, since you're proccing bleed so frequently on enemy targets, it will spread that bleed around and inflict other targets with that same status effect. So Shrapnel does work with Predator's Mark and is extremely powerful. If you are not going to be running a Pulse, however, I would highly recommend switching out Strike Back for Precision. That will be a definite increase to DPS overall and is a highly recommended talent if you're not running a Pulse. Jumping into the gameplay, I think it's really important to clarify that up till now I have not had high expectations from the Predator's Mark gear set. I wasn't really looking forward to building it. I didn't think that it would have a vast amount of potential or anything like that. But since building it on the live stream, since running it for a few hours in Last Stand, since seeing exactly what it can do, I have warmed up to it tremendously. I think that it's one of my favorite gear sets now. Not necessarily the #1 spot, but extremely, extremely powerful and something that I find a lot of joy in using. I have fun Last Stand games when I use this gear set, and that's for a variety of reasons. Number one, it synergizes very well. you can reliably proc the bleed with a high RPM gun like the LVOA-C or something like an MP7. Anything with a high RPM is going to be able to proc that bleed pretty much on cue at the beginning of fights. And once you do that, you actually slow down the enemy target and make it much easier to land consecutive shots. And that is where I oftentimes struggle. So this gear set plays right to one of my weaknesses and makes it into a strength and helps turn it into a strength. And it's something that's very fun to use. The bleed actually does do damage, though it did take a tremendous hit. It used to be 100% of the damage over the course of the previous 10 bullets, and now it's only 50%. And since that change, I kind of thought that, this gear set has become bad. It's not something I want to run, but boy, could I have been more wrong. That's not at all the case. It's something that is very fun to use, very powerful, has a lot of damage potential with the synergies between the 3-piece bonus and the percentage weapon damage bonuses there, all the different weapon talents, again, the high RPM and proccing bleed, and it does have a really great optimal range. One of the benefits of this, and one of the reasons I think that it should really catch on, and I hope that it does, is because it can counter the shotgun flinch in a very unique way. When a shotgun is trying to close the gap, close distance, and get in range of their high damage output and that really annoying flinch, they're going to start from far away. If you can bleed them before they even get close to you and drop down their health pool or blow their heal rotation before they even make it to you, you're going to have a huge advantage in that fight. And also, if they're slowed down, you can actually gain ground and get away from them. You can get farther away from them and keep them inside your optimal range, but outside theirs. Tactically speaking, this build has a lot of potential. It's something that can melt enemy agents very quickly. You can spec more into electronics if you really want to and get more utility out of it that way. But it is something that I consider to be a top tier DPS build now. I'm very excited that I built it, and it's one of my favorites. As you can see, again, dropping agents extremely fast. You can proc the bleed on any target. It's very, very simple. Once you have that bleed, the target is then slowed. And even though they can still technically, air quotes, sprint, they aren't sprinting as fast, and you can land more shots, and that's one of my very big weaknesses again. So that's why I really like the gear set. It plays into one of my weaknesses and makes it much less of a weakness. So it's something I can see myself running a lot more in the future. You can hit very high critical strikes because you have all these different damage bonuses, percentage weapon damage bonuses stacking on top of each other. You have one from the 3-piece of Predator's Mark. You have Competent, you have Booster Shot, you have Unforgiving, you have Responsive, and it all meshes together to create a build that I think is way more enjoyable than I ever previously thought it would be. It becomes absolutely devastating with Attack Link because you have that high RPM to begin with. That's another percentage weapon damage bonus, and you can annihilate enemy teams. And again, it works wonders for countering enemy Seeker Mine builds or enemy shotgun builds because its optimal range is actually further out than theirs. It definitely outranges a shotgun build and prevents them from gaining ground. It slows them down, stops them from gaining on you, and you can also shoot the Seeker Mines off the ground quite easily, so it's something I would recommend doing. You can gain ground on Seeker Mine builds, you can hover inside your optimal range and make sure that you have time. Don't close too close to them because if they drop the Seeker Mine, you won't have time to shoot it. You can hover on that range because you can bleed them and deal a ton of damage while defending yourself against their burst mechanics. So it's something I really enjoy using. Again, thank you guys for watching. I'm going to wrap it up there. As always, check out the links below if you want to support the channel, and have a nice night.